Saturnalia was one of the oldest and most popular Roman festivals. It began on December 17th, but grew over time, and by the imperial period, ended on December 23rd. On the first day of Saturnalia, everything in Rome shut down, and people were expected to forego their normal attire and instead wear plain, simple tunics. This included senators and magistrates and candidates for office, men who normally wore specialized togas, proudly displaying their status. Similarly, everybody from citizen to freedman to slave was supposed to wear a special leather cap that was normally worn by freed slaves to denote their status. They went to all this trouble because during the festival, the strict formality of the class system was temporarily thrown out the window. The entire theme of Saturnalia was to upend the social order and to celebrate liberty. To begin the festivities, a large crowd gathered at the temple to Saturn on the Capitoline Hill. Saturn was a god with a very complicated history and a lot of different associations, including with the Capitoline Hill, with wealth, with agriculture, and yes, with liberation. For most of the year, for reasons that are lost to us, the statue of Saturn outside the temple had its feet covered with some distinctive wool wrappings. These wrappings were removed by some priests, which marked the official beginning of Saturnalia. By the way, we're told that this statue was actually hollow and filled with olive oil, which is kinda neat. With the festival officially underway, a priest performed a sacrifice before the crowd. After this, members of the Roman Senate came forward. Somewhere nearby, there was another statue of Saturn, this one made of wood, carved specifically for this festival. Senators picked up this statue and carried it down to the forum. The crowd followed. After a time, they arrived at an outdoor banquet area. The senators placed the statue on a large reclining sofa that had been set aside for it. Then, with Saturn lazily overseeing the whole thing, there was a massive feast and the wine began to flow. After the feast, there was usually some gladiatorial games, where all of the different classes co-mingled and rubbed elbows. Like everything else, the games were supposed to continue the theme of upending the social order. For example, they sometimes featured women or dwarf gladiators. It was all meant to be funny, but it's worth saying that some Romans found these blood sports distasteful and stayed away whenever they could. My boy Cicero, for instance, hated them. Now, on a normal day, the gladiatorial event would have ended, the sun would have went down, and that would have been it. But on Saturnalia, they were just getting started. Rome's streets were normally dark and dangerous to navigate at night, but today, it was lined with decorative candles and torches. People took full advantage of this, and many partygoers stayed out all night. On Saturnalia, it was customary to loudly greet friends, strangers, and passers-by with the call and response, "Io Saturnalia." This was ubiquitous, and some Saturnalian Scrooges would say that they got pretty sick of hearing "Io Saturnalia" from drunken idiots outside when they were trying to read or sleep. Speaking of drunken idiots, it was also customary after the sun went down to host parties continuing the festivities. Once inside, a person was selected randomly, more or less, to be something called the Saturnalicius Princeps, which you can translate as the King of Saturnalia. The theme of overturning the social order continued, so this person tended to be a child or a slave. Custom demanded that any command given by the King of Saturnalia had to be obeyed without question. But it was all one big joke, so the commands tended to be things like sing a song, or do a dance, or everybody drink. The parties would continue with people drinking, playing games, and gambling all night. There were normally some legal restrictions on gambling, especially with dice, but these were all temporarily lifted for the duration of the festival. Even slaves would get in on the gambling, sometimes with their owners. If a group couldn't afford to bet actual money, it was quite common to bet nuts instead. People talked endlessly about how they were looking forward to the Saturnalian nuts every year. Apparently, it was a thing. I mentioned slaves, and we should probably pause here for a minute. The whole theme of Saturnalia was liberty, and slaves were an important part of that equation. Many social norms regarding slaves were disregarded for the duration of the festival. For instance, perhaps the most famous factoid about Saturnalia is this: slave owners would jokingly swap places with their slaves and serve them dinner. But let's not get too carried away with this role reversal. It seems that the more common practice was for the slaves to eat with the owners on equal footing, and for the owners to get up and serve the food themselves. In this way, you can kind of think of Saturnalia as an opportunity to give the slaves some time off, although that analogy is imperfect, since they were still on the hook for preparing the food. But in keeping with the spirit of the holiday, slaves were also allowed to speak disrespectfully to their owners without any fear of repercussion. But everybody knew that the whole thing was in the spirit of fun, and I couldn't find any actual examples of slaves going full Festivus and staging an airing of grievances. It seems more likely that owner and slave temporarily dropped the formality and spoke to each other as equals. That all happened on the first day of Saturnalia, but celebrations continued for a full week. The next day, the parties and gambling and drinking continued. On December 19th, the third day of Saturnalia, there was another little holiday called the Feast of Opalia. The purpose of this day was to honor Saturn's wife, Ops, who was a goddess of the harvest. There had already been one festival devoted to Ops at the end of the harvest season, and now in December there was a second one, celebrating the bounty contained in the granaries. By the way, Ops is where we get the English word opulence. On this day, the cautious hoarding of food for the winter was abandoned, and there were huge feasts. The nature of Saturnalia meant that people were already eating and drinking as much as they wanted, but nobody seemed to mind having the excuse to kick off another round of parties. Another important aspect of Saturnalia was the exchange of gifts. These were usually small items like toys or books or diningware or exotic foods. The most popular gift of all was something called a Civilaria, which was a small humanoid figurine made of wax or clay, basically a doll. During the month of December, specialized shops would pop up all over Rome, where you could have a Civilaria custom made and personalized as a gift. From what we can tell, the number of gifts exchanged was staggering. Basically, during Saturnalia, everybody expected to receive a gift from everybody they knew. And not just a gift, but also a short personalized note or a poem. Gifts were evaluated, and if somebody was caught sending a cheaper gift than they did last year, it was a problem. God forbid somebody send a gift and get nothing in return. As you can imagine, mistakes happened all the time, and people took note. On top of this, people took time during the festival to go door to door, visiting with neighbors and acquaintances. Small, generic gifts were expected to be given to anybody who came knocking, which added an additional level of complexity to the whole thing. Between all the gifts and personalized notes and feasts and partying and gambling, so much stuff was involved with Saturnalia that people would spend most of December just getting ready for it. Eventually, Saturnalia ended and life returned to normal. But before I let you go, let me share with you some short epigrams written for Saturnalia by a guy named Martial in the 1st century. Here's what Martial had to say. Nobody can be more luxurious than Charisianus. He walks about during the Saturnalia in a toga. In sending you neither silver nor gold, eloquent Stella, I have acted in your interest. Whoever makes great gifts wishes great gifts to be made to him in return. By my gift of earthenware vases, you will be released from such an obligation. The dish which you usually presented to me at the Saturnalia, Sextilianus, you have bestowed on your mistress instead. And with the price of my toga, which you usually gave to me on the 1st of March, you have bought her a green dinner robe. Your mistresses cost you nothing. You enjoy them at my expense.